critics have had, that Edward Snowden might be a spy with some kind of nefarious master plan, because you see this scramble in this hotel room that made me want to ask my first question, which was, it seemed like the planning for distributing this information to the reporters was very careful that you did. You had three reporters, there'd be backups, and you took precautions on how to cover the security for that. But it was almost as if there was no end plan beyond that for yourself. And so it seemed when you first arrived, you were talking about, you were the one who was going to be nailed to the cross, and you were ready to deal with it. But eventually, as the days went on, it seemed like there was possibility that arrived for escape and maybe a way out of that box you were in that room. So what I wanted to know was, what was in your mind, what was your original game plan in terms of where you thought it would end then, and did new things open up while you were there that offered you maybe a way out?
So I would say, first off, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear out there? Okay.
So what I would say is, when I look back on that period and I look at everything that happened and how complex it was and how everybody was working, in incredible amounts of time, the journalists, to get this out, to coordinate with the National Security Agency, other intelligence community agencies, to basically make sure that nobody was going to be inappropriately harmed, no one was going to be put at risk by this. We were kind of overcome with a sense that there wasn't enough time to do anything, and this was going to continue and continue and continue. And this was a feeling that they were new to, but had been consuming me for quite some time. Because going forward, I had to recognize that this was something of which I was only a very small piece. I was the mechanism of presenting information that had been concealed from the American people that we needed to know. We had our most senior officials in government, whether it was James Clapper, the Director of National Intelligence, Keith Alexander, former Director of the NSA. They were giving sworn statements in front of Congress that were false. And we have video of that now and can look back. It's not really a question of dispute. But when it gets to that level of severity, when the consequences for our democracy are so great, somebody has to step forward. But as far as what happens to them, that's an open question that they cannot answer. So when I discussed this with the journalists, I told them that my plan was not to decide for myself what should happen, but to ask the world for justice and go, look, are these programs consistent not only with national laws, but with international laws? How does it fit into a larger system, and what should happen? And it turned out that there were human rights lawyers who were very concerned about the things that had happened. And they began to advise me, and we moved forward from there.
So when you first went there, did you think you would be arrested, probably, and then it seemed possible that maybe you could get some sort of asylum?
The most likely scenario was always that I would be arrested and that I would get sent to jail. I don't think anybody on the team, whether it was myself, whether it was the lawyers, whether it was the journalists, had even imagined the situation would turn out like it eventually did. We were talking about some of the greatest and most sophisticated intelligence actors in the world, the world's sole superpower, and a number of officials, very powerful officials, who were personally embarrassed when it was revealed that, they had oversight over these things, and they had sort of abdicated that role. They had given up on controlling these programs and just said, look, don't tell us about it. We don't want to know about it. We don't care who it affects. We don't care about what impact it has on our system. Just keep it out of the public domain. I think the most real moment where the fact that we had passed the Rubicon became absolutely clear to me was when Laura Poitras sat down in front of me and she turned the camera on. It was me and Glenn Greenwald. He was doing the initial vetting, which was actually a lot more like a cross-examination. He's pretty aggressive when it comes to interviewing somebody. And we both immediately stiffened. We froze up. We looked at each other, and it was very clear that there's no going back. The only way we can move at this point is forward, and simply do the best we can to make sure that all of our actions from this point forward serve the public interest.
I mean, the reason I ask is there have been people who've said to me sometimes, well, why didn't he decide to just, do this act of civil disobedience and then pay the consequences? Be arrested, fight your fight in the courts, be like, Martin Luther King in the jail and writing from Montgomery. Did you ever contemplate possibly a scenario in which you might face American justice like that?
Well, absolutely. But I mean, the question there was, would the American justice system be open to that? And I looked at other cases previously from Thomas Drake, Chelsea Manning, all of the former whistleblowers, even people who weren't brought in front of courts, in the same manner, Bill Binney, Kirk Wiebe, Ed Loomis. But when we go back to Daniel Ellsberg, many, many years ago, we saw that he had the opportunity to stay free while he was in trial. He could go on the news, he could go to an open court, he could make the case in front of the jury, that what he did was he took his actions to champion the public interest. But in my case, and all of the cases of the last decade, we've seen that the way the law is being used in whistleblowing cases has changed. You're actually forbidden now from making a public interest defense if you're charged with under the Espionage Act, which are the charges they brought against me. Every country in the world actually recognizes the Espionage Act as what's called a political crime, which means it's not extraditable, and that it's not considered actually a legitimate charge. And that's because the crime that they're saying, the victim is not an individual. Like assassination is not actually considered a political crime because the victim is a person, it's an individual, it's someone who can be harmed. A political crime is what they call an act that's taken against an actual state, not individuals, but the state itself, not a nation, but the institutions of state. When you're challenging policies, when you're challenging laws. And normally, whenever these cases happen, you're allowed to address the jury. You're allowed to say, we may disagree, and you may find me guilty. You may say, I am a criminal, I deserve to go to prison, but you'll allow me to make my case. It's critical to remember that there were no whistleblower protections that would cover me as a private contractor. There were no proper channels through which I could have reported these concerns to individual independent actors who could review it and change these. All of the channels led to the officials who actually authorized these programs in secret, without public consent and without public knowledge. And that's a really serious concern because when we think about the way government works in America, the way democracy works in America, and more broadly, liberal societies function around the world, they function on the principle of the consent of the governed. And consent is not meaningful if it's not informed. If officials are making decisions for us behind closed doors, they're authorizing operations on the decisions of secret courts, where the judges on those courts are all appointed by a single individual, at this time Justice John Roberts. And they all say, this is okay, this is okay, this is okay. But the minute these issues hit the newspaper, we see something completely different. The president himself comes out on stage and says, you know what, these conversations have made us stronger. All of the review boards that are instituted find that these programs are not only dangerous to our civil liberties, to the rights that we've inherited, and to our Constitution as a document, but that they're also not necessary, that they've never stopped even a single terrorist attack.
But you basically felt the American system didn't really offer a possibility at this point for speaking out and having a fair trial and being able to put this argument across, I guess. And
well, the key there is that decision wasn't actually made by me personally. That was made by lawyers. I've told the government again and again in negotiations, that if they're prepared to offer an open trial, a fair trial, in the same way that Dan Ellsberg got, and I'm allowed to make my case to the jury, I would love to do so.
Oh,
But
really?
to this point, they declined.
But they won't assure you that you'd have an open trial. It would be in some kind of, I know in the Drake
They
trial.
want to use special procedures, basically.
Uh-huh.
They want to close court. They want to use things called like Classified Information Protection Act and
Right,
things like this.
right. And then
To
they
minimize the
use like
harm that someone can
sound
make.
machines to silence the person so the jury couldn't, the public couldn't hear what he was talking about at that point. So is that what you were afraid that there would be some kind of screening out of what your arguments would be?
Right. We saw this in the Thomas Drake case. This was a classic whistleblower. You actually wrote an article about him, I believe, so you should be fairly familiar with the case. And he exposed classic waste, fraud, and abuse. You know, these were classic, basically inarguable public interest issues. But they tried to railroad him. You know, they limited the arguments he could make. They limited the evidence that he could present. And they tried to put him in jail without anybody knowing or without it being able to be a public issue. Because reputations were off the line, not just reputations of individuals, but reputations of agencies. And that's a real concern because what we begin to see is what we saw last year when James Clapper raised his hand, you know, and swore to tell the truth, and then he told a lie in front of Congress, that's a felony that's punishable by, I believe, between 5 to 7 years in prison. But he faced no consequence. He didn't face even a slap on the wrist.
So how do you account for that?
When we hold basically our most senior elite officials to one standard of behavior, but we hold the working level people, you know, the whistleblowers, to a completely different standard.
Is it another form of too big to jail?
You know, I think there is some level of truth to that. And the reality is that I wanted to rely on the people to make the decisions about what should happen. And asylum claims were a great way to litigate that while the U.S. government, you know, decided how it really felt about these issues. But
I think
the too big to jail thing is something that we see spreading throughout society. As you mentioned, it's not just in the national security sector. We see it in the banking sector and so on and so forth.
I mean, part of the reason I wanted to go over this ancient history was that the film, I think, which I hope people see, is really fascinating. But you can see it's this changing, evolving situation that's sort of extraordinary. And one of the things that came out of it, which has caused, I think, you a lot of tough questions from people, was that you ended up first year in China and then you end up in Moscow, neither of which country is famous for its civil liberties. And so,
I think that's putting it graciously.
Okay, and so because of that, I think people have, you know, it's certainly made people wonder, well, why those choices? And I think what I took away from watching the movie was that it was this just kind of crazy work in progress. But I wanted to know. I assume maybe it was from Greenwald's book that you chose Hong Kong because it has a tradition of asylum, and that Moscow, it seems, was hopefully a way station. Is that fair to say?
Well, so I never planned to stay in Moscow. I was actually just transiting. I had a ticket on a plane that was actually headed to Latin America. There were journalists on the plane. They took pictures of my seat because Aeroflot, I guess, leaked my seat number. There's a little bit of irony there. But what happened was after I departed Hong Kong, the State Department froze my passport. So when I landed in Russia, I wasn't able to leave. I didn't, at the same time, want to put in an asylum claim. I wanted to continue. And, you know, I wondered about that. I wondered about the reasoning for the State Department, why they would want me to be in Russia, particularly when on TV at the time they were saying, you know, this guy knows all this information. He's got millions of documents, which was actually not true. I had actually destroyed the documents that I held after I turned them over to the journalists. And I was asking myself, why was this happening? And then, you know, the more I talked to people in the civil liberties community and the activist community about what was going on, the clearer it became that this was actually a political strategy. I had told the government, you know, that I wasn't going to be trying to blackmail them to do anything like this. And they believed me. And they realized that by putting me in Russia, they actually diminished my voice and they enabled a very powerful attack that would not be going away. Because, so formerly I worked for the Central Intelligence Agency, undercover overseas. So I know a little bit about how this works. if I had been the director of CIA or the FBI or the NSA, sitting at the National Security Council, the round table at the White House, in the Situation Room, going, how do we get this guy? The very best thing they could have done was allowed me to transit in Latin America, because the CIA has a very powerful presence there, and the governments and the security